President Cyril Ramaphosa says an immediate focus for the government is to enable struggling state companies such as power utility Eskom and logistics group Transnet to function optimally. Ramaphosa last night delivered the first State of the Nation address under a government of national unity. The president said government would launch another phase of reforms to try to lift economic growth above 3%. He also acknowledged that many municipalities lack the skills and resources to meet people's needs, and as such, the funding model for municipalities will be reviewed. For more on this, we are joined by a researcher at Wits University's Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, Thokozile Madonko. Thokozile, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, and good morning to your listeners.
So last night, of course, we listened to the president outlining these priorities for the 7th administration. I mean, there were 3 areas that he really focused on and said that the government wants to prioritize. That's inclusive economic growth, reduction of poverty, and building a capable state. What's your immediate takeaway from last night?
I was very excited by the president's speech, especially as it's the first major articulation of the government of national unity and the agreements that would have had to have been reached within the government of national unity. I think the tone was correct. I think the focus on those 3 areas is absolutely critical. But as always, the devil is in the detail. And our work and research has been looking at the ways in which government has been trying to unlock and stimulate economic growth over the last 30 years, but especially since 2012. And we've seen that, these grand plans get tabled, and talking about local government, absolutely essential. Re-looking at the financing of local government, absolutely. They cannot afford to deliver services. We need a new system of funding local government in order to enable them not only to deliver services, but to maintain services, to maintain infrastructure. So we need some kind of system that can also make local government resilient against climate change and other kinds of economic or health shocks, for example. So that's absolutely critical. We do need to focus on Eskom and Transnet. They need to be functioning, and we need to clean out all the dead wood and corruption and make sure that they are functioning in line with national interest. Yeah. And it is absolutely important that we then, on the 19th of February, when the finance minister tables his budget, that we look to see whether there's money where these policy priorities have been set.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's lots of provinces. I heard an analogy last night, and I don't know when it was, but it was between last night and this morning. I've listened to so much, but there was an analyst who gave an analogy, and I want to get your views on this because it really resonated with me in a way. He said that South Africa is like a child on a swing, and the president is the person pushing that swing. So he's constantly pushing it, and we get this excitement that we're going somewhere, and then we come back, and then he pushes us again in the speech and makes all these promises that we're going to go higher and higher, and then we come back, and at the end of the day we're actually in the same position and we haven't moved. But all the excitement and promises and the person pushing the swing is held down by a swing on a chain, and that's it. We're not really moving anywhere. This analogy got to me, and I don't know if that resonates with you for what the president is saying, because it's also a time to outline his achievements. So when we look at the president and promising to grow the economy by 3%, I mean, the economy has not grown further than 1% under President Ramaphosa. What do you think about those sentiments?
So I think that's a lovely analogy, and I would almost be a little bit controversial and stick my neck out and say that while the president is pushing the swing and many of his executive and line ministries are pushing the swing in one direction, you have our finance minister, our macroeconomic fiscal policy pushing the swing backwards. So we have at the moment a tension between what our stated policy goals are, but what that looks like in rands and cents is very different. And so our research and work that we've been doing at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits is to say that we need to relook at our macro policy because it's working against these really incredible ideas around youth employment, thinking about income support for the unemployed, dealing with gender-based violence, the whole list, empowering SARS and the National Prosecuting Authority. So all of these things are absolutely critical, but we have what at the moment is a fiscal consolidation policy, which is basically a fancy term for austerity. So we are seeing budget cuts. So we're seeing cuts to key line ministries like health, education, social development, but also cuts to infrastructure, interestingly enough. So it becomes a little bit confusing because we hear these huge numbers being thrown around infrastructure, but it's mainly based on the private sector coming to the table, government de-risking the private sector, and then supposedly this will then generate the income. But we haven't seen that happen. We've had this blended finance, public-private partnerships, leveraging the private sector for a while now, and we haven't seen the results that the president has been, he keeps saying, we're going to build, but we're not actually building.
Yeah, and we want to hear the words, we have built, because I think that's what South Africans are craving, is the fact that we've got terrible unemployment in this country. The economy is not growing. Jobs are not being created. Again, another we are going to do, and a promise that he made, is an industrial policy that drives economic growth. He's saying it'll be finalized and that the government will spend more than 940 billion rand on infrastructure in the coming 5 years. We've heard this before, and yet we're not seeing concrete things coming out of it. Do you think perhaps this is now the moment? I mean, are you satisfied with that announcement?
Unfortunately not. I mean, we were told through the medium-term budget policy statement that this was the goal of government. But again, we have to wait to see if the private sector is going to unlock its investments in order to make do on the president's commitments. And we haven't seen the private sector come to the table in the amounts of money that we need to be able to see the kind of investment that we're looking for. Importantly, there's research that shows that under fiscal consolidation, the current policy of austerity, that it's highly unlikely, if government is not coming to the table and investing in infrastructure, then it's unlikely that the private sector will do so. So we have this kind of slightly contradictory, dare I say, almost schizophrenic policy-making framework that is moving, as you said, in the swing, is pushing against each other, and we're not moving anywhere. And so we've argued that what we really need to see is increasing public investment in key sectors by government. So not this idea that we'll have government being the sort of de-risker and allowing for blended finance, but actually pumping much needed resources into the state, which then flows into the public sector, that then flows into the economy as a whole. So we don't want to be hearing about teachers being laid off or early retirement. We want he talked about a capable state, but at the moment we are not hiring. We have social workers that are unemployed, doctors that are unemployed, and so we're arguing that the evidence shows that investment in care, the green economy, and public infrastructure will have a multiplier effect in the economy. So it's kind of traditional old school Keynesian economics that says that when we're in a slump, the government must spend. And when it's boom times, then we can be a little bit, we can hold back a little bit, save a little bit. But the reality is the current macro fiscal policy that we are pursuing is working against the very ideals that the president and the government of national unity laid out yesterday.
The president did say that there's been an increase in job creation. And this is up for debate, no doubt. But obviously more needs to be done to eradicate poverty. This is to use his words. Are you seeing that? Is that a fair statement to make, that there has been an increase and people have more jobs in South Africa now?
So people have more access to employment opportunities. So, we also need to be very careful about the language that we're talking about, is that people might be wage laborers. So it's not a salary with a pension that enables a family to be able to participate in the economy meaningfully. And so we study inequality, not only poverty. So we've seen that wages over the last 15 to 20 years have actually been stagnating. So the real wage of the average middle class South African has not increased over time. Yeah. But the profits of the companies to which they work for have increased over time. So we've seen an uneven distribution of resources, mainly rands and cents, in the system. So we've got this huge pool of very hard workers going to work every day and not earning their fair share of the fruit of their labor. And so that's why it's absolutely critical that we need to relook at our tax framework and tax policy. We need to support the international agreements, and the G20 becomes a critical space for this, for a global tax agreement, so that we're seeing a fair distribution of the wealth in South Africa, enabling everybody to be better off, as opposed to these kind of very, very low poverty level wages. And even though they're working, and that's what the stats will pick up, but they're not earning enough to really meaningfully engage in the economy.
Yeah. I mean, we look at. I mean, the numbers given: more than 28 million unemployed and vulnerable people receive social grants. Now, that was a number that was given. The president also alluding to the fact that, I'm just quoting here, the social relief of distress grant is an essential mechanism for alleviating extreme poverty, and they're going to use this grant as a basis for the introduction of a sustainable form of income support for unemployed people. We've been hearing about this. This is something I know that's been in the pipeline. Do you think that this is now going to be the time that we actually see a basic income grant being introduced?
I mean, Leanne, I hope so. It's time. I think the conversation about what, if is over, and it should be when and how. And the most important thing is that South Africans between the ages of 18 and 59 who are unemployed have no support from the state. So, that's an untenable situation. And the evidence coming out of the research on the SRD grant and all the other grants show that they do alleviate poverty. They do enable people to have some kind of dignity, to be able to start small enterprises or little micro industries. So it is critical for our economy. And the reality is that the nature of work is changing, and also climate change. What is incredible about the conversation so far around a basic income grant is nobody seems to be focusing on the fact that we could have another COVID crisis tomorrow, and people will lose their income, and what will they have to fall back on? So why not set that system up appropriately? The SRD grant shows us that people need a backup. They need something in a catastrophic event, and whether it's floods, fires, unemployment. And so the nature of work is changing, our climate is changing, and so we need to provide rands and cents in people's pockets to enable them to engage in the economy and not to be left behind.
So we've run out of time. I mean, this is probably the last one I'm going to ask you, because I know that it's just so much that was said, and we can hardly touch on much of it. But that transformation fund, I mean, this has been a subject of debate and criticism, especially from business. Very quickly, what is your take that the fund will be 20 billion rand a year over the next 5 years?
I think, again, it's a case of not if, but when. And, we need to look at the structure of our economy, who is benefiting, who isn't, and how can we make sure that, transformation happens in a setting that is useful and appropriate for our national interests and national needs, as the president said. We need to come together as South Africans and to really think about our well-being for all as a critical space for transformation going forward.
Thokozile, thank you. Thanks for talking to us. Thokozile Madonko is a researcher at the Wits University Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, unpacking a small portion, really, of the President's State of the Nation address last night.